Calvin Coolidge served as president for the majority of the 1920s and is closely associated with the decade. He was known as Silent Cal, and while that is a bit of an exaggeration, there was something he was very silent about: the death of his son, Calvin Jr. It all started on a hot day on June 30th, 1924, outside on the south grounds of the White House. The temperature that day rose to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty hot for Washington, D.C. The president's favorite son, Calvin Jr., and his 17-year-old brother, John, were playing a game of lawn tennis. For whatever reason, Calvin Jr. went out wearing shoes but no socks. The press was also there to take photos of the presidential family. Perhaps because of this, President Coolidge wanted his sons to look presentable, as they usually did at home, so they played in wool suits despite the high temperature. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, and everyone went home happy. It was a busy time for President Coolidge, as he was preparing for the Republican National Convention that was less than 2 weeks away, and the upcoming presidential campaign. He had just been officially nominated 2 weeks earlier, and was expected to win an easy victory, as he was quite popular. But with all of this going on, within a few days, it was discovered that Calvin Jr. had developed a blister on the top of his third toe on his right foot. It had been caused by all of the activity during that tennis match, and the blister had become infected and turned dark. The boy was limping, had a fever, was swollen in the groin area, and had red streaks running down his legs. A doctor was immediately consulted, and Calvin Jr.'s condition was quickly recognized as being very, very serious. In time, it would be diagnosed as sepsis, blood poisoning. Antibiotics were still a few years away, so there was little that could be done in terms of treatment. The president was understandably distraught, and was now very distracted from fulfilling his political duties, rushing back and forth from his office to his son's sickbed. Charles Dawes, who was running on President Coolidge's ticket as the vice presidential candidate, happened to be at the White House at this time. As he passed Calvin Jr.'s sick room, he saw the president bent over the bed. He later described what he saw. "I have never witnessed such a look of agony and despair as was on the president's face." The newspapers got a hold of the story, though it was announced that there would be no formal bulletins released by the White House or the Coolidge family. President Coolidge was already a very private man, and this cut deeper into his emotions than anything else before. The president's and the nation's birthday on July 4th were virtually forgotten by the Coolidges. President Coolidge wrote a short letter to his father in Vermont, saying, "Calvin is very sick, so this is not a happy day for me." The next day, Calvin Jr. was transferred to nearby Walter Reed Army Hospital, where he received the best treatment the country could offer. He was given sedatives, and risky surgery was performed in an attempt to drain the poison. And while the operation was a success, it also wasn't certain if it had actually helped. But it soon became very clear that the sepsis was quickly spreading, and further surgery would be futile. And the doctors came to the conclusion that only a miracle could save the president's son. So all they could do was wait and hope. As with many cases of serious illness, Calvin Jr.'s condition improved slightly before taking a sharp, cruel turn for the worse, and he slipped in and out of consciousness. The next day, July 7th at 10:30 p.m., he died, with his parents at his bedside. John had remained at the White House. The news was announced over the radio from Madison Square Garden, and the ongoing Democratic National Convention adjourned out of respect for the president. The effect of Calvin Jr.'s death on his father's presidency was immense, though the president almost never spoke about it directly. But through his personal policy of strict privacy, there were some pretty clear hints at how this affected him. In his short autobiography, he devoted only one line to the matter. When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. It is believed that President Coolidge fell into a deep depression for the remainder of his presidency, and this contributed to his famous decision not to run again in 1928. As for the 1924 election, the wheels of motion were already turning, so he accepted an easy win and 4 more years as president, but had to endure it without his favorite son. He later made a touching comment to a friend about Calvin Jr. that might also double as a sign of his mental anguish at the cause of his death. He said, "When I look out that window, I always see my boy playing tennis on that court out there." On August 16, 1920, the Cleveland Indians were playing the New York Yankees at the Polo Grounds. At the top of the 5th inning, Ray Chapman, nicknamed Chappie, a popular player among Indians fans, was the first batter, pitted against the skilled pitcher Carl Mays, who used a very low submarine delivery, as you can see in this film. The first pitch struck Chapman on the left side of his head. The sound of the impact was so loud that the pitcher, Mays, thought the ball had hit the handle of the bat. This might explain why Mays didn't walk over to check if Chapman was okay, fielding the ball instead. Tommy Connolly, the home plate umpire, noticed blood coming from Chapman's ear and immediately called for a doctor in the stands, and 2 doctors rushed onto the field. The crowd became silent as Chapman was being examined. He stumbled up to his feet with assistance and was walked to the visitors' clubhouse, where he lost consciousness, and was carried the rest of the way by 2 teammates. Although the uncertain fate of Chapman left many fans and players anxious, the game would be finished, with the Indians gaining an important victory on their way to the World Series. Chapman was rushed to St. Lawrence Hospital, located half a mile from the Polo Grounds, where his head was x-rayed. A surgeon, Dr. T.M. Merrigan, made the decision to operate. Here is a description of the injury as reported in the New York Times on August 18th. The blow had caused a depressed fracture in Chapman's head 3.5 inches long. Dr. Merrigan removed a piece of skull about 1.5 inches square, and found the brain had been so severely jarred that blood clots had formed. The shock of the blow had lacerated the brain not only on the left side of the head where the ball struck, but also on the right side, where the shock of the blow had forced the brain against the skull. Chapman had his future planned out. If the Indians won the World Series, he would retire from baseball and go into business in Cleveland, and would be able to spend more time with his wife, who he had married only the year before, as well as the child they were expecting. Here is another excerpt from the New York Times. Before the game, the player had placed in the trainer's custody his diamond ring, a gift from his wife. Several times the stricken man tried to say ring, but he could not speak. He pointed to his finger. The operation lasted over an hour, ending at 1:44 in the morning. Chapman would die 3 hours later at 4:40. He was 29 years old, and left behind his wife and unborn daughter. Chapman's pregnant wife had been called at the beginning, before the seriousness of the injury was apparent. She arrived in New York at 10 a.m., but it was already too late. A priest who was also a friend of Chapman's took Mrs. Chapman to a hotel to tell her about her husband's death, and she fainted. Chapman's coffin was shown in New York for a few hundred people, including players from the Indians and the Yankees, where it was said, "There was not a dry eye among the scores of men who thronged the room about the bier." Carl Mays, the pitcher who threw the fatal pitch, voluntarily participated in the investigation, and he was recorded as saying, "It is the most regrettable incident of my baseball career. I would give anything if I could undo what has happened. Chapman was a game, splendid fellow." There were suspicions against Mays because he had a controversial habit of hitting batters on purpose, or at least trying to buzz them around the head in order to intimidate them. But Mays claimed that he had stopped doing that, and that that was not what had happened with Chapman. He said that the ball had had a rough spot on it, which made it turn unexpectedly. At that time, there was considerable debate over spitballs, which meant using saliva, dirt, or other substances to make the ball move erratically and unpredictably when thrown by a pitcher. Mays had been notorious for utilizing this technique. Even though Mays obviously hadn't wanted to kill anyone on purpose, not everyone believed that he was entirely blameless, and players from the Boston Red Sox and the Detroit Tigers, among others, called for him to be banned from baseball. The president of the American League, Ban Johnson, decided not to take further action against Mays, believing that it had truly been an accident. The Yankees manager, Miller Huggins, said that he believed Chapman's shoe spike had caught on something in the dirt at home plate, preventing him from moving out of the way of the ball. Indians pitcher Ray Caldwell said that Chapman had seemed to duck into the path of the ball, and if he hadn't moved, he probably would have been hit in the shoulder. Indians player/manager Tris Speaker called for peace toward Mays, saying, "It is the duty of all of us, of all the players, not only for the good of the game, to suppress all bitter feelings. We will do all in our power to avoid aggravating the unfortunate impression in any way." Chapman's funeral was held in Cleveland on August 20th. Carl Mays went into seclusion for a little while, and did not join the Yankees when they went to Cleveland for 3 games. Plans for a memorial for Chapman in Cleveland began immediately, and money was raised through a local Cleveland newspaper. More than 15,000 people donated 10 cents each. A bronze plaque was made and displayed shortly after at the Indians' home field, League Park. In February 1921, Chapman's widow gave birth to their daughter, who she named Ray, spelled R-A-E, almost certainly in honor of the father she would never meet. Immediately after Chapman's tragic death, rules for more safety gear were considered. At least one manager, Pat Moran of the Philadelphia Phillies, distributed protective headgear to his players in 1921, but ultimately the decision was left to each team. Batting helmets were not required throughout Major League Baseball until the 1950s. Unfortunately, there was more tragedy for Ray Chapman's family. His widow, Kathleen, did remarry, but she still suffered from depression as a result of his sudden death. In 1928, she committed suicide by drinking poison. The next year, Chapman's daughter, Ray, died of measles at only 8 years old. But there was a little bit of good news, too. The Cleveland Indians would go on to win the World Series 2 months after Chapman's death, and the team dedicated their victory to him. And most recently, in 2007, the original 1920 Ray Chapman Memorial plaque was rediscovered, after being completely forgotten in storage for decades. Although the plaque was in poor condition, it was meticulously cleaned and is now on display at Progressive Field in Cleveland, hopefully never to be neglected again. Ray Chapman remains the only Major League Baseball player to die from on-field injuries. The next person was closely associated with the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter. Lord Carnarvon was, as you might have guessed by his title, born into a prominent and wealthy British family. He was involved in a serious car accident in the very early days of the invention, all the way back in 1903. The injuries would last in some form for the rest of his life. Due to these injuries, a doctor recommended that he recuperate somewhere abroad during winter, so Lord Carnarvon and his wife went to Egypt, where he quickly became interested in Egyptology, a fairly common hobby for wealthy European men at the time. In 1907, Lord Carnarvon funded an excavation in Egypt where he met Howard Carter. The two men continued to work together, and even jointly wrote a book about their findings. In 1914, they began their excavations of the Valley of the Kings, where many Egyptian pharaohs' tombs had already been discovered. It was generally believed that there was little of interest left to be found, though they were both especially keen on finding the tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun. After years of searching, they had turned up little. Lord Carnarvon decided that 1922 would be the last year he would sponsor excavation efforts there. But on November 4th of that year, at the 11th hour, Carter sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon saying that he had discovered a tomb. Less than 3 weeks later, Lord Carnarvon and his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, arrived at the site. A few days later, Carter was able to peer into the tomb through a small hole he had made, resulting in the famous exchange when Lord Carnarvon asked, "Do you see anything?" To which Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." On March 19, 1923, Lord Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito on his right cheek while in the Valley of the Kings, then accidentally cut the wound with a razor blade while shaving. He apparently didn't think it was anything to be concerned about, but he would quickly find out how serious it really was. The wound immediately became infected, and eventually developed into blood poisoning in the head and neck. Only 2.5 weeks later, on April 5th, he died at a hotel in Cairo, Egypt, and his body was sent back to England to be buried. His death is closely associated with the so-called mummy's curse. There was a belief among some people that ancient Egyptians had used magic spells that would curse anyone who stepped foot in a pharaoh's sacred tomb. A less supernatural idea was that the ancient Egyptians had placed poison in the tomb to kill intruders. One clue that people pointed to was that Howard Carter had written to a friend a few days before Lord Carnarvon's death, "This tomb has brought us bad luck." In the 1920s, there were still many superstitions, and the spiritualist movement remained fairly popular throughout much of the decade. One of the leaders of the spiritualist movement was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He was quoted as saying, "A malevolent spirit may have caused Lord Carnarvon's fatal illness." He went on to say, "I think it is possible that some occult influence caused his death. There are many legends about the powers of the old Egyptians, and I know I wouldn't care to go fooling about their tombs and mummies. There have been other instances of persons who met with unfortunate ends under similar circumstances. We know that all the powers of the ancient Egyptians were used to guard their mummies, and they must have had great powers. Of course, I don't say that some Egyptian spirit did kill Carnarvon, but I think it is possible. There are many malevolent spirits. There was a mummy in the British Museum which became noted because of the series of misfortunes which befell those who had anything to do with it. The excavators, the workmen who carried it, the photographers who photographed it, and others seemed to be pursued by an evil influence. Virtually everyone in the Egyptology and academic spheres quickly dismissed such beliefs in the mummy's curse, pointing to a long list of archaeologists who had excavated ancient Egyptian tombs and had nothing bad happen to them. The best example for this is Howard Carter, who was in the same place at the same time as Lord Carnarvon, and had even gone so far as to look upon the face of the dead King Tut, something that Lord Carnarvon had not been able to do. In a 1934 letter, Carter claimed that the Pharaoh's curse story was invented by a journalist and rival Egyptologist named Arthur Weigel. Carter called the curse rumor Tommy Rot. Regardless, the story of the curse will always be connected with Lord Carnarvon's death, even if there was no truth to it. In the end, the tale of the mummy's curse was just a more interesting one than a simple infected mosquito bite. The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb was an international sensation, and while Lord Carnarvon wasn't constantly excavating at the site like Carter, he played a very important role by making it all possible through his wealth and patience. But unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to experience just how influential the discovery became. Now with Part 4 and Part 5 all newly remade, in the near future I'll be posting a full collection of Parts 1 through 5, but with the segments shuffled around a bit. I also re-recorded all the segments from Part 1 because I still wasn't satisfied with them. But I promise I won't just re-record things over and over and over. But I'm leaving the Part 1 video as is, so the new recordings will only be in the collection. And then finally, I'll get around to doing Part 6. I know I've teased it for so long, and the truth is that I've had the script completed for many months, but I wanted to clean up the problems with the previous parts before moving on. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.